Greetings and welcome. We are in Senior English B, and right now your hymnal should be open to page 1179, and Louis McNeice and the introduction here to Louis McNeice. We're going to look at two poems now. The first one is by McNeice on 1180, and the second is the Spender poem, Not Palaces, on 1183. You should have your annotations in front of you. Let's start with the Carrick Revisited poem. And I'm just going to give you some information that's kind of like a schemata to help you get ready to know how to read these poems. They're not really complicated poems, and we ought to be able to work through them relatively quickly, but I still think maybe having a little bit of background can help you. First of all, I would suggest that you maybe jot down a couple of things about the Carrick Revisited Louis McNeice poem. If you'll look there, there's a picture on 1180 to give you some sense of what this poem is about. The first thing you want to write down is this poem is about a castle. All right? A castle. So, see, there are some of us who have never even seen a house as large as this school building. Okay? But there are some of us who have never seen a house that this school building would be the shed for that house. See, some of us don't even have a sense of what that would even look like. I mean, how could, in heaven's name, how could a house be that large? You know what I'm saying? And because we're unaccustomed to that, maybe it doesn't quite hit us. Now, when you talk about the castle, you're not just talking about the physical structure of the building, but you're also talking about the grounds. If any of you have watched this show on PBS called Downton Abbey, you're maybe familiar then with the large mansions that will have 50, 60, 70 bedrooms. And then there will be all the other rooms, okay? And then there will be this large, sometimes miles and miles and miles of grounds around it, okay? Let's talk about this poem now. The poem takes readers on a journey back. That's the first thing you want to do. This is kind of a reflective piece. Back to the poet's birthplace, especially McNeice, in an effort to understand, define the influences on the artist's identity. One of the interesting questions that you could jot down at 3B is simply this one. Are you where you grew up? That's an interesting question. Are you where you grew up? Are you the town you grew up in? Are you the state that that town was in? Are you the neighborhood that you grew up in? Are you the house that you lived in? Are you a product of your bedroom, the room that was yours, right? And the ways that you either fixed it up or you didn't or whatever, right? This notion of identity as being somehow linked to a place in the past is central to this poem. The speaker, we're going to go ahead and presume that it is McNeice, describes this Carrick Fergus, this amazing castle. The castle, the green hills, familiar sights, sounds. In that regards, at 3A, you want to make a comment. It's a lot like Wordsworth coming back to Tintern Abbey again and remembering what it was like once before. As he tours the natural and the human landscape, recalling Carrick of his childhood, the poet will acknowledge the irrefutable influence of Northern Ireland, and that's a key here. We're going to get a little regional. Northern Ireland. A chance, he will say, particular. Neither the pure Irish of the West, nor the pure English across the water on his character. In other words, this place has somehow made him who he is. Let's go ahead now and listen to the poem. Notice its divisions of stanzas. And as you listen and read, jot down anything that is specific to what he was influenced by. Take a look.
Carrick Revisited by Louis McNeice. Back to Carrick, the castle as plumb assured as 30 years ago. Which war was which? Here are new villas, here is a sizzling grid, but the green banks are as rich, and the loch as hazily lazy, and the child's astonishment not yet cured. Who was, and am, dumbfounded to find myself in a topographical frame. Here, not there. The channels of my dreams determined largely by random chemistry of soil and air. Memories I had shelved peer at me from the shelf. Foghorn, Millhorn, Corn Creek, and Church bell, half heard through boarded time as a child in bed glimpses a brangle of talk from the floor below, but cannot catch the words. Our past we know, but not its meaning, whether it meant well. Time and place, our bridgeheads into reality, but also its concealment. Out of the sea we land on the particular and lose all other possible bird's eye views. The truth that is of itself, for itself, but not for me. Torn before birth from where my fathers dwelt, schooled from the age of 10 to a foreign voice. Yet neither Western Ireland nor Southern England cancels this interlude. What chance misspelt may never now be righted by my choice. Whatever then my inherited or acquired affinities, such remains my childhood's frame, like a belated rock in the red Antrim clay, that cannot at this era change its pitch or name, and the prenatal mountain is far away.
I want to just for a second point out this line at line 14, 15. Our past we know, but not its meaning, whether it meant well. Now I've had seniors that say that's one of the more intriguing lines. Look at it again. Our past we know. In other words, you know your past. If right now we were to sit down and start talking back through your past, you could list things, right? Some of you can even remember things like if I were to say, take me to the locker that was your freshman locker in this building when you first arrived here as a freshman, ready to go. Some of you will say, I couldn't do that. And then you start thinking about it, you're like, you know, I guess I could find my way, feel my way there, because it's like my past. Look, go back to the line. Our past, we know it. What don't we know? What don't we know? What does it mean to say the meaning of our past? What does that even mean? The meaning of our past. What does it even mean? Our past we know. You can sit down right now and make a list of all the stuff that's happened to you. But what McGee suggests is that you have to get quite a bit older before you can begin to understand the implications of those events. What does it mean, for example, to have grown up where you grew up? What does it mean to have had the parents that you had? What does it mean to have had the schooling that you had? Notice for McNeice, a lot of it has to do with the language that he learned, right? Because living in North Ireland, he's going to, of course, have been forced to learn English, and what are the implications for that? See, here's the question. Often until you get much older, you don't really appreciate and understand the importance of all the stuff that happened to you as a kid. Right now, you're still kind of young enough to say, dude, it's just kind of happening to me, one thing after another. But by the time you're 40 and beyond, you'll begin to try and see some sense of patterns, the way things all kind of work together, the implications. It's an interesting poem in that regards. Why is Carrick revisited in this poem? What does revisited mean? Yeah, he's coming back to it. Do you see on page 1181 that sidebar that tells you that this castle was built when? You're looking at the picture on 1180. This castle was built when? Whoa! 1177. Just flip back one page and see this guy's dates. Right? He almost made it to 1977. Which would, so you start doing the quick mathematics. So in other words, that house lasted quite a while. Right? And in the process of a house lasting a long time, it itself has a history of its own, right? All right, let's go down to the second poem I told you we'd look at, Steve Spender's poem. Interestingly, Spender, look at his dates on 1182. He dies in 1995. See, so here you go. You're talking about a poet who has a life that ends very close to the time when you were born, right? So you get a sense we are now starting to move into that time period with poets and writers that come closer and closer to the time of your birth. Let's talk about Spender for just a second in regards to this not palaces. And the first thing I want to do is read with you on 1183. Do you see the background information? Now, this poem, you might put it in your notes, is a poem where poetry meets architecture. I'd write that down. Where poetry meets architecture. In other words, the way buildings are built and designed. Your picture on 1183 kind of helps you with this project. Now let's talk about the poem for a second. First of all, this poem is going to be a work of contrasts. The aesthetic value of art and the notion of social change. Let me put it in easy language. Can poems really matter in the world? Okay. Here the poet's going to discuss and then ultimately reject the idea that art should be merely a palace for an elite few people. A beautiful home for the imagination remote from society. He calls emphatically instead for commitment to social action, asking artists to inspire change. One of the key things about the 20th century will be that poets increasingly become more of and by the people, or they don't succeed. One of the primary ways this happens for you guys is through music. I mean, if you'll think about it, you've got people who in another time, think of the artist Eminem, classic example. In another time, this artist would have just been a poet. Right? He would have been a poet. He would have written poems that articulated a certain view of the world. Right? And those poems would have just been published as poetry. The kind of stuff Steve Spender's writing right here. But notice in your time, instead, Eminem will find an avenue to bring his poetry to mainstream, and the way he does it is through music. Right? So that large numbers of people are affected by his music, his poetry. Notice, it's for the people. Right? Much of the music that you've grown up with, you could say this about. That it actually is poetry in its lyrics. Right? But it's going to have something that works for a lot of people. So a lot of people will say, I hate poetry, but the first thing they do when they get in their truck is turn on their music. Oh, really? See how that works? Right? I loathe poetry. I don't see any point in poetry. Poetry is a waste of time. But then they love to watch music videos. Okay, I don't understand. Wait a minute. What's the... Right? Some similar kind of thing. Let's read the background information on 1183. In the poem's unifying metaphor, and you want that to be. A unifying metaphor means what? What's that mean? The whole poem is going to be constructed around a single comparison or a metaphor. Spender is going to say that he will not build old-fashioned poems that are like palaces, beautiful, ornate structures remote from the masses. What does it mean to be remote from the masses? What does that mean? Remote from the masses means nobody normally, understands anything that's being said, right? Instead, he hopes to build active, modern poetry more like the steel and glass skyscrapers that began with the International and the Bauhaus architectural styles of the 1920s and 30s. Right? These buildings create dynamic spaces by combining strikingly simple forms with superior industrial craftsmanship. You're looking at an example in the picture on 1183. See, this is another interesting question. Are we as a people our buildings? See, think about it. That's a question a lot of seniors say, I don't even know what you mean. Or I don't say it another way. Yeah, how about this? What if we all got on an airplane and I flew you to Rome? What's the first places we would go to look at in Rome? See how this works? The buildings. Buildings. We wouldn't go to the great restaurants, although ultimately we would. Where would we go first? Well, we'd go to buildings. What if I put you on a plane and took you to London? Where would we go first? We'd go to buildings. What if I put you on a plane and took you to New York? Where would we go first? We'd go to Times Square. Guess what? All defined by what? Buildings, right. What if I were to put you on a plane? See how this works? Wait a minute. What if I put you on a plane and sent you to Cairo? We'd go right outside of Cairo and look at what? Buildings, the pyramids, wouldn't we? In some strange way, the human species is defined by its buildings. As the 20th century unfolds, especially in the 1920s and 30s, architects begin to ask a very simple question. For those of you that know Ayn Rand's Fountainhead. Maybe you can jot that title down at 3A. This is another novel I can recommend to you. Architecture starts to become more about utilitarian purposes. Uh-oh, what do I mean when I use that term? Utilitarian means what? Practical. You got it. Write it down. More practical. Spender is going to argue in the poem Not Palaces that poetry should be practical. All right, let's listen to this one now. And we'll just kind of get a sense of what he's saying. Jot down at 2B, central metaphor is this thing about building and architecture. Let's ask if it works for you.
Not Palaces by Stephen Spender. Not palaces, an era's crown where the mind dwells, intrigues, rests. Architectural gold-leaved flower, from people ordered like a single mind, I build. This only what I tell. It is too late for rare accumulation, for family pride, for beauty's filtered dusts. I say, stamping the words with emphasis, drink from here energy, and only energy, to will this time's change. I, gazelle, delicate wanderer, drinker of horizon's fluid line, ear that suspends on a cord the spirit drinking timelessness, touch, love all senses. Leave your gardens, your singing feasts, your dreams of suns circling before our sun, of heaven after our world. Instead, watch images of flashing glass that strike the outward sense, the polished will, flag of our purpose which the wind engraves. No spirit seek here rest, but this: no one shall hunger, man shall spend equally. Our goal which we compel, man shall be man.
Now it's interesting, several things about this poem that becomes in some ways very prophetic about what did happen, in fact, to much of mainstream art. Notice on page 1183 at line 6, he says, "It is too late for rare accumulation, for family pride, for beauty's filtered dusts." Can I say this without insulting you? You will not read 99% of the poems that we cover in senior English unless I assign them to you. Would you agree with me? Right? In other words, it's not wake up in the morning, I need to read some T.S. Eliot today. I'm going to go and find T.S. Eliot poetry. But almost all of you this morning got up and turned on music, or put it in your ear, or listened to it on your drive here. And that music, much of it had words. Now that's interesting. If we did nothing but print the words from all of the songs in your iTunes list, we just printed the lyrics. See, we know that you know most of those lyrics because you've been listening to that music long enough. What would those lyrics say about you and to you? See, Spender's already predicting that art is going to become more about making us more interconnected. Look on page 1184. It's going to be about two things. Notice, energy. Do you see it? Lots of energy. Why is it that the music, for example, of Eminem, I use him as a classic example because so many of you know his music. Whether you like his music or not doesn't matter. What is it about the music of Eminem that became so popular? You would argue had a lot to do with the fact a lot of energy, and it was definitely different from the time of its origin, right? In other words, it was able to kind of create some kind of interest that then grew, and now everybody listens to this musician, right? We could say this about any number of artists that you listen to. Finally, notice the last second to the last line. The word equally is there. In other words, Spender was already predicting that if poetry did not leave the high palace and become part of normal people, it would die. People would no longer care about it. See, you don't know who the great living poets are right now, and you don't care. But you get in your truck or your car and you turn on music. You watch movies that are, of course, inspired by a poetic vision, right? A Steve Spielberg film, for example, begins with a script. He wrote that, and then it plays out on the screen. Let's suggest maybe poetry has changed for your generation. And it's not this stuff that we read. It's almost like coming into our English class is like going into a museum where we're looking backwards at the beginnings of the stuff that you today understand as poetry. But would you agree, your iTunes playlist is different from Shakespeare's sonnets? But what Spender's going to argue is, you don't have your iTunes playlist without Shakespeare's sonnets. Now see, we're able to appreciate Shakespeare without liking Shakespeare. Do you understand? Because are you ready for this? In a few hundred years, possibly, our textbook looks differently in some parts. And all of a sudden, some of the people that you listen to now, their lyrics end up in a book. Right? Where they become the poets of your generation. Remember when we asked the question, Monuments of an Aging Intellect, from the Yeats poem Sailing to Byzantium? Remember that question? See, here's the hard part of that question. We don't always know what's going to survive, do we? We don't know. Some of the music that you listen to might survive 500 years. And a lot of it might not be so much the music as the lyrics that are written. Who knows? There's no way to know all the time, right? But what we do kind of understand is that music and poetry accumulates over time, right? So you kind of have these, one person kind of pushes and then the next. So for example, Eminem probably cannot make the same music that he makes 50 years earlier. Would you agree with me? Right? I mean, his music immediately would probably be banned. Did you follow it all a few weeks ago, the celebration of 50 years ago that the Beatles performed on the Ed Sullivan Show? That was 50 years ago. And of course, for you today, you're like, yeah, big deal. But you don't have Eminem without that kind of music of the Beatles era. See how that works? In other words, everything's kind of building towards what will be the next thing. As you age, what will be fascinating for you is to notice the ways in which music changes. Believe it or not, there will be some young person in your life here in a few years who will look at you and say, why are you listening to the old fart music? And you're going to go, what are you talking about? This is an old fart music. And they're going to be like, why are you listening to modern music? No. And then you'll immediately remember that, oh yeah, the old man said that in 303. There would come a moment when you become a relic. You become a fossil. You're old fart. You're old time music. And that may happen for some of you before you're 30. And the music that you're listening to, some kid's going to say, why are you listening to like modern music? Why is that what you have to listen to? And then they will play their music, and your first instinct might be to go, yeah, that isn't music. Yeah, you think that's music. Let me tell you what real... And in that moment, you become an old fart. You become Shakespeare. You're a relic. You're like a piece in a museum. And some young kid's going to look at you and go, oh man, I hope I don't end up like you, some old person. That's pathetic. And in that moment, of course, everything comes full circle. When you did it to your folks and said, really? That's not music. That's like some kind of old stuff. Why don't you listen to real music? Fascinating how it works, right? We often forget. We build, see, okay? So there you go, 2 poems. What do they have in common? Jot down at 3A. What do they have in common? These 2 poems both deal with what? Issues of the what? Yeah, the past as well as the future, don't they? Right? Both of them are backward-looking as well as forward-looking, right?